Well, good afternoon. Realized I forgot to turn this computer on and have it fired up and ready to go, so bear with me just one moment. If I seem a little sad tonight, it's because I got to go back to school tomorrow. It's been a great summer, but it's now over. We can start counting down days till next summer. So I enjoy teaching, and I'm looking forward to seeing some bright, smiling faces next Tuesday or Wednesday or whenever it is they're going to show up. I can't even remember. Okay.
What about our bright, smiling faces?
Well, I'm used to seeing your bright, smiling faces. I'm going to meet a whole bunch of new bright, smiling faces. I've looked over all my, looked over all my class rosters, and I don't know most of them because I haven't had them yet. So that's always an interesting first week or two as I try to learn about 120 names and match faces with it and everything. There it is. I'm up and running. Okay, sorry about that. I was here way early today too, and had everything ready to go, I thought, except evidently that. So we are wrapping up, hopefully. We're into the last section of Isaiah, of this section of Isaiah tonight. And y'all know me well enough to know I have no idea if we'll finish it or not, but I've got it all on here, ready to finish if we get through it all. So we are ready for, now this won't work. Now it will. Okay, good grief. All right, there we go. So we are ready for chapters 54 and 55, and we've been in this sorry, also I'll say I mowed yesterday, so I've been sneezing all afternoon. So I've got my trusty box of Kleenex here. We've been in Isaiah 40 through 55 comprises one section, and it's the first 39 chapters were written to the pre-exilic nation, Southern Kingdom, and written to a time contemporary to when Isaiah lived, and then he writes chapters 40 through 55 to the nation when they're in exile in Babylonian captivity. Well, that is not till about 150 years after Isaiah really is active as a prophet. And then when we start in chapter 56, that'll be to the post-exilic, to the people that return from exile. And so we've got three distinct sections of Isaiah, and we're ready to kind of wrap up this section with these last two chapters. And the tone of these last two chapters, as I read through these, is really awesome compared to some of the stuff that we've read as Isaiah was dealing with, and God through Isaiah was dealing with some of the rebellion or some of the people that were resisting God's chastisement or the people that were trying to assimilate into Babylonian into the Babylonian culture, and they were rebuked and they were chastised and they were talking a lot about punishment and what's going to happen if you don't go the right way. These last two chapters really are beautiful because it's a promise of restoration that comes along with the return from exile. And so as we read through the text tonight, just take note of the tone and how it sounds. It's really an uplifting and beautiful section of Isaiah. So get everything arranged here. And if you recognize the title, My Thoughts Are Not Your Thoughts, if that stirs memory of a scripture, we'll get to that one, hopefully tonight. So in Isaiah 55. So our objectives for tonight, the student will understand the three metaphors of Isaiah 54 that offer the exile's reassurance. And the student will understand the teaching about God's ways, thoughts, and word. And that really drawn from some thoughts in chapter 55. So, as always, we start with kind of a quick review of some of the major things we've learned in this in this part of our study of Isaiah. 40 through 55 can be chopped up into two major divisions. 40 through 47, the prophet seeks to remove the idols of Babylon from Israelite thinking and theology. A lot of sections in there about the foolishness of idolatry and how silly idolatry is and those kind of things. 48 makes that transition, and we see the language shift from calling the Israelites, referring to them as Jerusalem, to now referring to them as Zion. And the focus really begins to be on the return. And so the prophet focuses on leading Israel out of Babylon. And here we're really inundated with passages about the servant in those chapters, kind of culminating in that chapter last week that we looked at from the end of chapter 52 into chapter 53 with the suffering servant. And the structure of these last few chapters that we've been through, we see this back and forth, God talking either to or about the servant, and then either to or about Zion. And Zion we identify as the remnant that is returning out of exile. So we have this just kind of a contrasting sections back and forth over and over again. So another real quick question. Isaiah writes to the Babylonian captives. What two central questions does Isaiah answer?
Does God care?
Does God care?
Does he have the power?
And does he have the power to do anything about it if he does care? Okay? And Isaiah, by the question here, I asked, how does he answer those? Isaiah answers those questions. How does he answer those questions? What are some things that stand out from our study or in your memory that, for instance, show us that God does care? What are some things that show us that God does have the power to act? Didn't know you were going to be quizzed tonight, did you? I'm getting back into teacher mode for school. Pop quiz. What did we talk about last week? What was the big thing last week? The suffering servant, right? So which one of those two questions does that answer? Does both, but primarily, does God care? Does God care? Yeah, he's going to send somebody to handle all of the difficulties that we've brought upon ourselves. The sin that has separated us from God, the problems that we've had as a nation. God has a plan in place, and a servant that is coming to take care of those things. What are some things that we've talked about that show that God has power?
When he took them out of captivity, he gave them everything they needed.
Okay, so when he leads them out of captivity, remember that was one of the complaints, or one of the things that the Israelites threw up, is like, how can you've seen Babylon, right? They're a really strong army. And then God gives some examples about, I've led people out of captivity before. You remember that place called Egypt? We took care of that. And he refers back to past victories and past things that he has done. And we've drawn those out of the text on several occasions when God refers back to things from the past to demonstrate that he's going to be able to do this at the present time.
And then it was a little bit more of a laid-back exit.
It is, yeah, we talked about that with it being it's not a rush this time. It's more of a stroll out of captivity because God has taken care of everything. Also, those sections about idols, the comparisons between the idols and what they're incapable of doing versus what God is able to do, is a demonstration of his power over and over again as he compares himself and contrasts himself with idols. So it's good for us to know the two questions that are answered, but we also are two questions that are asked that are kind of driving the story forward in this. But we also need to relate the text to those questions and see how the text answers those questions. Okay, so that gets us through a review now into Isaiah 54. Isaiah 54 can be divided, you can kind of divide it up two different ways. One way is to look at it just as two chunks of text. We've talked about salvation oracles before and how they are these pronouncements of how God is going to act or what God is going to do to protect the people or save the people. And we really have what can be called two salvation oracles in verses 1 through 10 and there's verses 11 through 17. In his notes, he always calls those hallmark cards from God because they are a specific kind of like, you send a Hallmark card is for a specific purpose. It's like a graduation card or a Mother's Day card or something like that, and it addresses that issue. And so these salvation oracles typically are pointed at a specific issue, and they are addressed in such a way so that they kind of get to the heart of the matter in that way. The other way that you can divide it up is by looking at the three extended metaphors that are in Isaiah 54, and that's the way he divided it up in the notes. So that's the way it shows up in my slides, and that's the way it is in the handout. So guess what we're going to do? We're going to look at the three metaphors and kind of divide it up that way. So three extended metaphors that we find in Isaiah 54. We have the husband-wife metaphor, which is kind of the most prominent one, and then we are going to talk about Noah and the flood, and we're going to talk about war. So let's look at the first metaphor, and specifically we'll get into it just by looking at verses 1 through 3. Shout for joy, O barren one, you who have borne no child. Break forth into joyful shouting and cry aloud, you who have not travailed. For the sons of the desolate will be more numerous than the sons of the married woman, says the Lord. Enlarge the place of your tent, stretch out the curtains of your dwellings, spare not, lengthen your cords and strengthen your pegs. For you will spread abroad to the right and to the left, and your descendants will possess nations and will resettle the desolate cities. First of all, we need to notice that this husband-wife metaphor is sort of the more prominent. It's the most fully developed. It kind of takes it to the extreme, or takes it further as a metaphor than we go with the other two, which is fine. I don't know that that's makes it a more important metaphor or a better metaphor. It just is the one that most of the text is dedicated to. So here at the beginning, Israel is compared to a barren woman, but then we're also given the command to rejoice. And we don't rejoice at the barrenness. We rejoice because the barrenness is coming to an end. We rejoice that which, in their culture and society would have brought sadness and would have brought difficulty to their family because they were not carrying on that name, or they were not bringing the next generation in. That's coming to an end. And think of the number of Bible stories that this harkens back to. I mean, Abraham and Sarah. Who else? Hannah. Anyone else? Rachel. Yeah. Jacob and Rachel. Sarah. And then even New Testament wise, we've got Elizabeth and Zechariah. It's kind of a central theme through the Bible that we see these stories being propagated and brought down through an unexpected route, because you have women or family that are going through these periods of barrenness or periods of not being able to bear children, and that poses a problem because God's made some promises that depend on those lines of succession and depend on those things taking place. And if they don't take place, then God's promise is broken. And so it's really kind of drives the story forward in a lot of ways, that God, through barrenness, is able then to still keep his promises. And so here, if you look at, for a period of 70 years, Israel will be in captivity in Babylon, and the land is fallow, the temple is laid to waste, the city of Jerusalem is destroyed, the land of their inheritance is in the hands of enemies, all of those things, and it looks like God's promise is not going to unfold. Looks like God's promise is being derailed. But God is saying, no, we're in a period of barrenness, but that is going to be over, and we're going to rejoice because of the success that is coming out of it. So we go from the idea, or the picture there is from barrenness to expansion. And so he tells them specifically that, I have to go back a slide there to the stretch out the curtains, or enlarge your tent, stretch out the curtains of your dwelling, lengthen your cords, strengthen your pegs. All of those things are about expansion. They're about getting bigger. And that's the opposite of barrenness. When you go through that period of barrenness, the family is shrinking and it's not going to continue. But then we're going to spread abroad to the right and to the left. And so God is promising expansion to a nation that has been in captivity. And that's hard to wrap your mind around. The only way that happens is through restoration, and God is promising that restoration. Verses 4 through 6 continues that same metaphor, husband and wife. It says, "Fear not, for you will not be put to shame, and do not feel humiliated, for you will not be disgraced. But you will forget the shame of your youth, and the reproach of your widowhood you will remember no more. For your husband is your maker, whose name is the Lord of hosts, and your Redeemer is the Holy One of Israel, who is called the God of all the earth. For the Lord has called you, like a wife forsaken and grieved in spirit, even like a wife of one's youth when she is rejected, says your God." So the joy of the future here is going to overshadow that time of lament that is brought about by being barren. And the coming reversal will overshadow the barren time. The Creator God is the husband who has called his grieving wife. And he has comforted her through promising her that her barrenness is coming to an end. And again, this reminds me of that story of Hannah, where her husband, he did all he could to comfort her. He didn't have the power to end her time of barrenness as God does, but he still, heaped love upon her and made sure that she knew that she was valued and that she was cared for, even in the face of the difficulty that she was undergoing. And so God here is that faithful husband who is able to provide then for his wife a way out of her reproach, a way out of her difficulty. And then continuing that same metaphor, verses 7 and 8, "For a brief moment I forsook you, but with great compassion I will gather you. In an outburst of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting loving kindness I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer." So the exile here is compared to a time when the husband forsook his wife. And, in order for the wife to be able to conceive, there's got to be cooperation from the husband. And if she has fallen out of favor with the husband and he is not willing for there to be that relationship to continue so that she can conceive, then her time of barrenness will continue. But even though he had forsaken her, even though he had put her away for a time, he now has welcomed her back and he has called her back into that loving relationship so that he can provide for her the child that she so desperately craves. I forgot to go on to that one. So the husband forsook his wife, but then brought her back with great compassion. And then the final verse, this is where dividing it up as the metaphors kind of makes it skip around a little bit. He goes on to verse 13 and includes this as part of that husband-wife metaphor, even though it's kind of in the middle of the next section or kind of in between the next two sections, actually. But he included this verse with it, so we'll go with it. Verse 13 says, "All your sons will be taught of the Lord, and the well-being of your sons will be great." So it kind of follows that theme of the time of barrenness is ended, and now there are children that need to be taken care of. There are children that need to be considered here as part of the family. And so he says, although it's separated from the original metaphor by the Noah and the flood metaphor, this one continues in that same vein of husband and wife. So not only has the barren woman borne children, but she has borne many children who have spread out far and wide. But these children have been taught by God. And we know that children were a central part of the old law. If you think back to one of the most important passages in all of Israel, Deuteronomy chapter 6, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God is one God. You shall love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength." And then what? "And you shall teach your children." When you rise up, when you lie down, when you're walking in the way, when you're sitting by the side of the road, at all times you're supposed to be teaching your children about God. And in this case, God has taken on the role of teacher. And that is that I mean, how do you take that? If God has come in and says, you know what, now I'm going to teach your children. Is that a good thing or is that a bad thing?
It's always good.
It's always a good thing when God's doing the teaching. And I think God maybe here is, there's been a time when, when God has said, you haven't taught my children the way that I expected you to or the way that I wanted you to. And we've seen that. We see that like in Joshua's generation where the next generation that came after Joshua didn't know the Lord. And we see this in some other places where we have these generations raise up that are not being taught about God. And God is going to take on that role for himself. And so it's not, I mean, on the one hand, you hate to point it out that they failed, but on the other hand, God is providing a way for their failures not to continue on into the future. And so this verse is actually quoted twice in the New Testament. So the ultimate blessing and the restoration of the relationship is that the children will be taught by God. John 6:45, Jesus there says, it is written in the prophets, they will all be taught by God. Everyone who has heard the Father and learned from him comes to me. And so Jesus there uses that same passage. They will all be taught by God. And then 1 Thessalonians 4:9 references this passage as well. Now about your love for one another, we do not need to write to you, for you yourselves have been taught by God to love each other. That might work its way into a sermon here sometime as we are talking about the subject of love. But we have been taught by God to love one another. How did that happen? Seeing if you're awake.
Because God taught us.
Jesus. What did Jesus tell his disciples? A new commandment I give you, that you love one another as I have loved you. I've shown you what to do. Now it's my expectation that you go out and do it. So he has shown us and taught us how to love by sending us his son. So that passage there in Isaiah, God has become the teacher. We're living examples of that today. Metaphor number 2 is Noah and the flood. And we'll see that in verses 9 through 12. It says, for this is like the days of Noah to me, when I swore that the waters of Noah would not flood the earth again. So I have sworn that I will not be angry with you, nor will I rebuke you. For the mountains may be removed and the hills may shake, but my loving kindness will not be removed from you. My covenant of peace will not be shaken, says the Lord who has compassion on you. O afflicted one, storm-tossed and not comforted, behold, I will set your stones in antimony, and your foundations I will lay in sapphire. Moreover, I will make your battlements of rubies and your gates of crystal, and your entire wall of precious stones. So, how is... before I go to the next slide and show you what I have, how would you say this situation of the exiles returning mirrors or in some way serves as a picture of Noah and the flood? It's not fair. I got to look at the notes before I had to think about that, but I'm making you think about it before I show you. What part of the story does God mention?
Floating the earth, and you can't even see the mountains.
When I swore that the waters of Noah would not flood the earth again.
Rainbows.
So the rainbows, the covenant at the end of the flood cycle. The flood is abated, and God comes and makes the covenant with Noah, and he swears that the waters will never flood the earth again. So what is he swearing to the people that are returning from exile? I will not be angry with you or rebuke you. Now, does that mean that they've got a free pass to do whatever they want? Yep, you can't get mad at us, God, you promised.
No, absolutely.
That's not what that means. It means that how has God, he basically makes the same promise to Noah. I won't get mad like this again. I won't get mad to the point of destroying the world by flood That doesn't mean there won't be punishments. Doesn't mean there won't be other consequences for sin, but I'm not going to express my anger in that way again. And so that's the promise that he's making to the children of Israel. Just as God ended the flood, so now he is ending exile. God promised Noah no more floods. What promise does God make here? He makes them the promise that he will not be angry or rebuke to the point of sending them once again into exile in the same way that he has sent them this time. Doesn't mean that there won't be punishment for sin. It means that they won't be taken away into a foreign land into exile again, in the same way that this has happened. So, and then in those last two verses, the chaos of the flood is contrasted with the foundations that God will lay for their kingdom. So you have the picture of the hills being overrun with water, and the water sweeping everything clean upon the earth. But then God says about them that, I will make I will set your stones, your foundations in antimony. Antimony is one of those hard gemstones. It's valuable, it's hard, it endures over time. Same with sapphires. They're valuable, but they're also, that gets handed down from generation to generation for a reason, because it's not going to turn to dust. It's not going to blow away. And so that's the pictures that we see, that God is going to establish them, and they're not going to be swept away as they have been through the flood or through captivity. So that's the metaphor number 2, Noah and the flood. Metaphor number 3 then is the metaphor of war. We're a meta-war. So verses 14 through 17, in righteousness you will be established. You will be far from oppression, for you will not fear, and from terror, for it will not come near to you. If anyone fiercely assails you, it will not be from me. Whoever assails you will fail because of you. Behold, I myself have created the smith who blows the fire of coals and brings out a weapon for its work, and I have created the destroyer to ruin. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper, and every tongue that accuses you in judgment you will condemn. This is the heritage of the servants of the Lord, and their vindication is from me, declares the Lord. I like that passage. That one just just kind of sends chills up a little bit about the power of God and how God is going to vindicate them, and that there's no weapon again that can be fashioned against them can prosper. The song that, if no weapon that's fashioned against you will stand. And just the picture of that is a beautiful picture. The return from exile will end oppression and terror. I can't imagine being a refugee. I can't imagine being in captivity. I can't imagine, the things that they went through during that period. But oppression and terror are two words that describe what they've been through. And God has promised them that their return is not going to be that. I'm going to free you from that. I'm going to deliver you from oppression and terror. And so those things are coming to an end for them. And that had to be just a wonderful thought as they were contemplating what their future was going to be. Any future wars, he says, will not originate from God, and God will protect the people. He says that if anyone fiercely assails you, it will not be from me. Remember the promise he has just made to them that was like the promise he made to Noah, that he would not rebuke or be angry with them in the way that he has on this occasion. So he's not going to send an army against them to take them into captivity again. So that's a good thing. Okay, chapter 54. Any thoughts, any closing thoughts on chapter 54? We're making good time. I think we might do it. I just jinxed it, didn't I? All right. 55, 1 through 5. This section he entitled God's Invitation. Ho, everyone who thirsts, come to the waters, and you who have no money, come, buy and eat. Come, buy wine and milk without money and without cost. Why do you spend money for what is not bread, and your wages for what does not satisfy? Listen carefully to me, and eat what is good, and delight yourself in abundance. Incline your ear and come to me. Listen, that you may live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, according to the faithful mercies shown to David. Behold, I have made him a witness to the peoples, a leader and commander for the peoples. Behold, you will call a nation you do not know, and a nation which knows you not will run to you, because of the Lord your God, even the Holy One of Israel, for he has glorified you. So, the choices confronting Israel are to buy from Babylon their food, their sustenance, or to accept the free substance. I think I should have put sustenance there. The free substance of God. And so that's the choice they have before them. They can cling to Babylon, which, by all earthly accounts is an awesome kingdom. They're powerful, they're strong, they've got a lot of stuff. Or they can go back to be restored to their homeland, where God has promised that he's going to take care of them. So the food from Babylon is costly, and it doesn't satisfy. They have to give up a lot to stay there. They have to give up a lot if they're not going to accept God's offer. And then ultimately it won't satisfy them. But if they take God's offer, what he offers them is free, and it will satisfy. It will give life. So what's the deal? Why is there a choice to be made? Why would we even consider what Babylon has to offer?
What are our choices today? What does the world
Indeed.
have to offer compared
What
to
are
what
our
God
choices? Yeah.
has to offer?
I mean, is our choice any different than theirs?
Not at all.
It really isn't. I mean, what the world offers, it costs us everything, and it ultimately doesn't satisfy. What God offers is free, and it gives life.
Remember, you put out the 3 different categories of Israelites in the nation.
Yes,
Some of them had assimilated and didn't want to leave.
they had found a home there. They had found, they had a business, or they had friends, or they had married into the Babylonian or into some other captive nation's family or whatever. And so there were lots of reasons that people could come up with to essentially stay in slavery, stay in captivity. And some did. Some chose that. I like the idea here that God is a God of covenants. In verse 3, he says, "Incline your ear and come to me, listen that you may live, and I will make an everlasting covenant with you, according to the faithful mercies shown to David." So this idea of covenant, and I think we're going to see another mention of covenant here in a few verses, but so there may be redundancy in the slide just if we get into it here. But what other covenants are there that we can think of?
That
God's
he made with
covenants?
Abraham.
Okay, Abrahamic covenant, Abraham's covenant,
Blood covenant.
blood covenant. Okay,
There's actually 2 major ones.
yeah.
Passover.
The Passover.
And then Christ.
Okay, so and then Noah. We've already talked about Noah. That was a covenant. He makes a covenant here with the people that he won't send them into exile again. We have the covenant that he makes with David, that he will have someone sitting upon the throne. He reiterates that covenant with Abraham. He reiterates that to Isaac and Jacob. We have the Sinai covenant made through Moses at the foot of Mount Sinai, that was established the 10 Commandments. I mean, it seems like God's got a thing for covenants. Is that,
Keeps his promises.
God is okay being bound through covenants because he doesn't have a problem keeping his promises. And so his covenant, the covenants are really never for him. they're always for us, right? I mean, they're always for the recipients of the covenants. And you even have that picture of Abraham when he enters into the covenant with God. There's the historical tradition was that they made these, they sacrificed the animal, they divided it into two halves, and then the two people making the covenant would walk through together. But, that Abraham sees it in a dream and God walks through on his own. You can't enter into a covenant with God. Abraham can't keep that covenant. Only God is the one that's bound to that covenant. And so this picture of God entering into a covenant with man is, there aren't other gods that do that. I mean, that's one thing that sets Jehovah God apart from false gods. He's willing to enter into covenants with his people, and he is a God of covenant.
Of course, now we have covenant now through Jesus.
Yeah, we have a new covenant that was promised through Jeremiah
This one
that
will
Christ
last till the end of time.
that Christ has established with his blood. And so we have, we today are under a covenant with God. And so here he talks to them, I will make an everlasting covenant with you according to the faithful mercy shown to David. David, then he says, is a witness. I have made him a witness to the peoples. So David is a witness that God's covenants are true, even though at this point that covenant is still in effect, but David at this point doesn't have that everlasting person sitting on the throne. But God can speak of it as though it's already happened, because God keeps his promises, God keeps his covenants. And eventually David will be able to stand and say, God has done exactly what he said he would do, and so this covenant is in effect. This covenant will be kept by God who is faithful. And then that last verse, he says, you will call a nation you do not know. Think of their relationship with the nations, Israel's relationship with the nations over the last century or so when they're in captivity. They've been at the mercy of other nations. And when other nations come to them, it's for the purpose of conquest. It's for the purpose of overthrowing them, for destroying them. And now God is saying, nations are going to come to you, but it's not for the purpose of overthrowing you. It's not for attacking. It's to come and learn from you. It's to come and see the blessings that I've given you. So this covenant that God is making with them is one that's going to draw other nations to him, to Jerusalem, to Israel. Does that sound familiar? Daniel with the whole kingdoms and the dream with Nebuchadnezzar with the statue and the rock hewn from the mountain that destroys the statue and it ends up swallowing up the whole world. I mean, that's it. That's God keeping that promise or reiterating that promise during the time of the exile and then fulfilling that promise through Christ. Verses 6 through 11. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. Let the wicked forsake his way, and the unrighteous man his thoughts. Let him return to the Lord, and he will have compassion on him, and to our God, for he will abundantly pardon. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, nor are your ways my ways, declare the Lord. For as the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. For as the rain and the snow come down from heaven, and do not return there without watering the earth, and make it bear and sprout, and furnishing seed to the sower and bread to the eater, so my word will be which goes forth from my mouth. It will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire, and without succeeding in the matter for which I sent it. Here we have God graciously calling the people back to himself. And we see that at the beginning. Seek the Lord while he may be found. Call upon him while he is near. God is always been about relationship. That's always been his emphasis, his goal, his desire to be in relationship with his people. And it's always their sin that drives a wedge in between them so that relationship cannot be what he wants it to be. But he continually calls them back. And here he is specifically calling them back. Tim.
Seek the Lord while he may be found. That sounds like there'll be a time.
Well, and I think there are other passages in the Bible that would indicate that, Solomon, remember now your Creator in the days of your youth, before the evil days draw nigh, and you say, I have no pleasure in them. So I think it is biblical to think about there being a time in life when it becomes harder and harder to repent.
Lazarus.
Lazarus, the rich man and Lazarus. The rich man really wished he could have a do-over, but it was past time. And so there is a time coming when the Lord will not be able to be found. And we want to make sure that we have found him while we can. And so he is offering that. I mean, he is calling the people back to himself. They've been in captivity. They've been punished. They've been separated from him because of their sin, but he is drawing them back. And so the contrast here, there are two opposing sets of thoughts and ways. There are God's thoughts and man's thoughts. There are God's ways and man's ways. But really, it's not just generic, the idea of any man's thoughts or any man's ways, because if what about those people that are heeding God's call, that are doing what God has asked them to do? Whose thoughts are they following? They're following God's thoughts. Whose ways are they following? They're following God's ways. And he brought out an interesting point here with this passage, that sometimes this passage is used to to talk about the idea that God is not understandable. Like God's, how many times have you heard people say, "Oh, I don't understand that. God's thoughts are not my thoughts. God's ways are not my ways, and so I just can't understand it." That's really not what this is doing. God has went to great lengths throughout this story that we've unfolded here in Isaiah. He's gone to great lengths to make his ways known, to make his thoughts known. He wants them to understand his thoughts. He wants them to know his ways. And time again, they have refused. They have chased after their own ideas, their own logic, their own hearts. And so that's the contrast. The contrast is not just between man in general and God all the time. The contrast is between God's way and my way when I'm not following God. Okay? That's the contrast. And I thought that was an interest. I don't know that I'd ever thought of it that way, and I thought that was a really good point that he made in the notes, that we need to read that correctly for what it is.
You actually hit it, what I was thinking.
Okay.
Because unless you're seeking God's ways, they're not going to make
Yeah.
sense. So.
Yeah, and so we want God's way to be our way. We want his thoughts to be our thoughts. Now, I understand we could get technical about it, and I can never fully understand God. I can never fully discern, his character or everything about him in this lifetime. But what he has made clear, what he has made known, what he has delivered to us, that's available. And that's what we need to accept, and that's what we need to pursue. So that is the good news, I guess, of that portion, or that part. Some other, I think, familiar or thoughts in that passage. The idea of my word which goes forth from my mouth will not return to me empty, without accomplishing what I desire. He talked about, it's compared to the rain and the snow. Once it begins its descent from the clouds. I don't know if you heard that at 5 o'clock this morning. It was like an alarm clock for me. It was a big old loud thunderclap, and then that rain. There was no stopping it. That rain was coming, and there was nothing we could do to stop it. And it was going to accomplish its purpose. It was going to accomplish what it set out to do, no matter how bad we wanted to save up some for a future date or whatever. And this is the picture that's painted there with God's word. God's word, he has set these things into motion. And that covenant that he has made, the covenant, the everlasting covenant, the covenant that he's made with David. Once God has enacted those things, there's no stopping them. And so once God has set his will into motion, it's going to be carried out. Last two verses. For you will go out with joy and be led forth with peace. The mountains and the hills will break forth into shouts of joy before you, and all the trees of the field will clap their hands. Instead of the thorn bush, the cypress will come up. Instead of the nettle, the myrtle will come up. And it will be a memorial to the Lord for an everlasting sign which will not be cut off. Here we have just kind of one final announcement of the return. We've seen this announcement made a couple of times through this section. And this is God one final time saying, the return is about to take place. I'm about to call you home. And so that's a very good thing. And the imagery that's there is just is beautiful. And one thing that I did not do, because I knew I wouldn't have time to, in this section, if you'll go back sometime, if you're looking for something to do for 15 or 20 minutes in Bible study, go back and read Isaiah chapter 40 and really take note of the imagery that's used in Isaiah chapter 40. Think about all the things that we've studied in this section, and then read chapters 54 and 55 and see the comparisons between some of that imagery. If you look back to Isaiah chapter 40 verses 1 and 2, he talks about the hills and the mountains being flattened. And here, the hills and the mountains become witnesses for what God has done. And you see that kind of thing just kind of mirrored from Isaiah 40, the introductory chapter of this section, and then you see it in Isaiah 54 and 55, the conclusion of this section. You see a lot of those metaphors or a lot of those word pictures that were introduced in chapter 40 finding their full fulfillment in these last two chapters. So it's kind of a neat little side study that you can do if you want to go do some more in-depth Bible reading in Isaiah. What significance do the promises God made to those returning from exile hold for us today?
Well, the question you asked at the beginning, what do you think? Does he exist?
Does he care?
Does he care? And does he have the power?
Does he have the power? Okay, so Isaiah has been answering those two questions all through this section. And are those two questions valid for us today? I think so. It's okay for us to ask that question. Does God have the power to do what he said he could do? Does he care enough to save us? If the answer to either one of those is no, we're wasting our time, right? And so we want to be able to answer yes to both of those. And this section of Isaiah really drives home for us that God does care and God can act. And that brings us comfort. It brings us assurance in our beliefs today. Okay? Good. Any other thoughts on that? Good answer. Why is God's word so often compared to food?
Like our daily bread,
Yeah.
sustenance.
Because it feeds the soul.
It feeds the soul. Okay.
It feeds our spiritual life.
I think food it's universal. We could, sometimes it's compared to other things, like, it's compared to maybe farming or something. And maybe back in their culture, more people were tied to the earth and understood those farming metaphors. You go to an inner city church today and you start talking about farming, you're probably going to lose some people. But if you start talking about food, they're going to understand that metaphor. They're going to understand the connection.
Well, you have to think about the people then. There was no such thing as wealth
Right.
for the vast majority of them.
Yeah.
Food was their primary focus.
That's right. From sun up to sundown, what we got to worry about today's food. Give us this day our daily bread. It didn't say fill my pantry, give me enough for a week. Give me enough for today. I like it.
Mama Dillon's wasn't baking.
What's that?
Mama Dillon's wasn't baking.
Mama Dillon's did not have a bakery back in those days.
Well, if you use the analogy of my dad, he stopped eating and he lost all strength.
Yeah.
So
If you stop eating physically, you lose strength, you lose mass, you lose cognitive function. I mean, you lose a lot of stuff, and so if you stop eating spiritually, then spiritually it's those same things are there. You lose mass, ability. Okay. All right. Next week, we're going to start the next section, Isaiah 56, 57. And this section we'll see is addressed to the ones that have returned from exile, the post-exilic Israel.